What's up, y'all? My name is JR, and for those of you who don't already know, I'm a huge movie and TV nerd. If you're new here, I appreciate you taking the time to check out my channel. I hope you'll consider sticking around and joining the film community I'm trying to build here on YouTube. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about how Wes Craven's meta horror slasher film, Scream, managed to change horror films forever. And just so you guys know, this video will contain some mild spoilers, so if for some reason you've been under a rock for the last 30 years and you haven't gotten around to watching this movie yet, and you don't want to know anything that happens in it, you might want to exit this video now. And with that being said, no more wasting time. Let's get into it. Scream is an American slasher film directed by Wes Craven and written by Kevin Williamson, released in 1996. The movie stars David Arquette, Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, Matthew Lillard, Rose McGowan, Skeet Ulrich, and Drew Barrymore. Set in the fictional town of Woodsboro, California, Scream's plot follows high school student Sydney Prescott and her friends who, on the anniversary of her mother's murder, become the targets of a costumed serial killer known as Ghostface. Now, Williamson, who was struggling to get his projects off the ground, was inspired by reports of a series of murders by the Gainesville Ripper as he wrote a screenplay that satirized the cliches of the slasher genre popularized in films such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Developed under the title Scary Movie, Williamson's script became the subject of an intense bidding war from multiple studios before Miramax Films finally purchased the rights. Craven, despite turning down the opportunity multiple times, finally agreed to direct the film after he had read the script, as he was determined to reestablish himself after several career setbacks. The involvement of Barrymore and Cox helped secure more support from the studio. Principal photography took place from April to June of 1996 in California on a budget of $15 million. Craven then trimmed down the violence in the film after being involved in a tense conflict with the Motion Picture Association of America over the desired R rating. Released on December 20th of 1996, Scream was not expected to perform well due to concerns over releasing a slasher film in a time normally reserved for holiday entertainment, but it went on to gross approximately $173 million worldwide through the strength of word of mouth, becoming a surprise success and one of the highest grossing films of the year. Reviews praised the performances of its cast and its unique meta humor, but criticized its excessive violence and lack of suspense in favor of that humor. The film helped elevate Williamson's career as a writer and raise the profile of the rest of the cast. And because of that, Scream is now regarded as one of the greatest horror slasher films ever made. It has been credited with rekindling interest in the horror genre during the 1990s following a decline in the genre's popularity. It has remained influential as Barrymore's involvement helped make participating in horror films more acceptable to prominent actors and increase horror films' appeal with younger audiences. The success of the film launched a multimedia franchise which comprised of the sequels Scream 2 in 1997, Scream 3 in 2000, Scream 4 in 2011, Scream in 2022, and Scream 6 in 2023, as well as an anthology television series. Now, at the time of the making of this video, the movie still has a 78% on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 125 critic reviews, and the film's popcorn meter currently sits at 80% after all these years, based on over 250,000 ratings. The film has a Metascore of 60 on Metacritic, based on 49 critic reviews, with a user score of 6.7 based on 388 user ratings. And finally, it has a 7.4 out of 10 on IMDb with over 400,000 ratings. Now look, the scary movies of my childhood, the most popular ones anyway, have all been mentioned. Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Those are the movies that I watched as a kid, or that I snuck and watched when my parents wouldn't, necessarily let me watch when I was a kid. And those movies typically consisted of a single killer on a rampage, getting clean, with Halloween being the first. And the biggest questions that you had during these movies were, one, why was the killer killing everybody? And two, who was going to be the final girl, so to speak, right? Jamie Lee Curtis started that whole final girl phenomenon with the first Halloween movie. And it was a horror film story beat that movie would spend the next 30 years copying, essentially. But Scream, when it came on the scene, it managed to up the ante by adding a third question. Who is the killer? Like I said, in Halloween, we knew the killer was Michael Myers and no one else. In Friday the 13th, the first movie, Jason's mom. But after that, it was Jason. And then in Nightmare on Elm Street, it was Freddy. I thought Freddy was the more charismatic of the three. He had more pop, more personality, which I think kind of made the films a little funny, but scary because, Freddy could get you in your dreams. That, you kind of be like, you can't run from that, right? And so as a result, Freddy was the one I was the most afraid of. I could remember being a really, really, really little kid going, I don't want to go to sleep after watching A Nightmare on Elm Street. But Scream, managed to ask the question, who is the killer? Scream took the slasher film and it made it a mystery. One that audience would spend equal amounts of time trying to figure out as they watched the movie before it was finally revealed at the end of Act 3. And the twist is, and I always tell you guys, the twist has to twist, especially in a horror movie. The twist absolutely has to twist. And especially in the first film, the twist is, there's not one killer, but two. Which made it that much harder to guess who the killers were beforehand, because you know how that process of elimination goes in most people's heads, right? Who's around when the killer shows up? Those people aren't the killer, right? But in this particular film, they were able to kind of flip it so that, Billy Loomis was able to kind of convince people that he wasn't the killer, because killer, when he gets arrested, people were still getting attacked while he was locked up in jail. And then even, he fools Sydney again by having Ghostface show up while he's literally standing there next to her. And I thought, that was kind of brilliant. I remember when I watched this movie for the first time going, oh my God, like I never, ever, ever would have guessed that it was two people doing the killing. That thought never entered my mind, but it does now. It definitely does now, because not only has Scream done that over and over and over again, but other movies have kind of copied it as well. Scream made use of multiple killers. And like I said, each of them could be in the room while the other was present and in costume, which made the reveal at the end of Act 3 much more interesting. And the screenwriters would also come up with a fairly thorough explanation as to exactly why the killers were killing, who they were killing, just before the final girl would find it within herself to then do away with the killers somehow. Very Scooby-Doo, right? And I would have got away with it if it wasn't for you kids, right? The Scream franchise also made the 10-minute cold open a franchise staple, which I believe also changed the genre forever, because Drew Barrymore being in that film, I think, elevated the film's popularity by at least 50%. And the whole question, what's your favorite scary movie? There are people now who, if you were to say that, they know exactly what you're talking about. And some of them weren't even born in 1996 when the first movie came out. I think that, the cold open of Scream is just as memorable as the movie itself. And in fact, maybe even more so. If you were to play that scene right now, again, like I said, everyone knows what movie that is, even if it didn't have a title or anything like that. If you were just to play that one scene, everybody knows what that is. That scene, Drew Barrymore made that scene an iconic horror film scene. And, in case, the fact that they've made, 6 of these movies and a TV series spanning almost 30 years at this point, doesn't convince you about this film's staying power, this film franchise's staying power, and its significance as it pertains to the horror genre. And you've forgotten just how influential the Scream franchise has been in that regard. This is the movie that influenced other slasher movies like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, Prom Night, and Sorority Row, just to name a few. And I got to tell you, I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend, for the people in my age group, I don't want to say my age, but I know I'm aging myself, but the people in my age group, those films are staples as well. We were older by the time we got I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend, but we all remember those movies as well, and we all watched them religiously. when Scream arrived on the scene, horror films and the horror genre in general was kind of stuck in a bit of a rut, I think. I think a lot of the innovations that had come to characterize the genre, in the 80s had become quite stale and derivative and repetitive, right? And the 90s had been given to that whole cat and mouse thriller with horror elements sprinkled in. While the traditional teen slasher films kind of languished and kind of, went, to the wayside. But I think all that changed when Scream, debuted in 1996. And again, 5 days before Christmas at that, to make $174 million during a holiday season. Like back then, no one was really looking to go see a scary movie during Christmas time, especially when you had movies like Home Alone and Home Alone 2, those types of movies were kind of coming out, and those movies are kind of iconic in their own right. But Scream managed to transform 90s horror, and it paved the way for generations of smarter and more genre-savvy filmmakers to kind of come in. And now I think that horror is currently kind of basking in a sort of renewed golden age, so to speak. Even with Hollywood kind of, being in a bit of a lull, you've got, filmmakers like Jordan Peele, who I deeply respect and admire. And, we got more cerebral horror films, kind of like, It Follows and Get Out, Get Out being held as a genre elevating masterpiece in its own right. And, with many of these horror films are starting to shape the cultural discourse, as it were. But I still think it's important to recognize the role that Scream played in the genre's evolution to even get to this point in the first place. I think that this was a film that managed to bridge the gap between 80s horror and the horror that we have now. And I think it's probably the most influential horror franchise in doing such a thing. Even though, look, it included, overage teenagers, right? 28-year-olds playing 16, right? Plots that were filled to the brim with tropes and crazy, bloody, over-the-top deaths, which I still happen to think is a necessary evil to truly make a great horror film all these years later. When I'm watching horror movies now, the first thing I'm thinking is, okay, enough people didn't die, but we'll cross that bridge at another time. But I think the horror genre has since become overly saturated with films following Scream's kind of, self-aware, herky-jerky horror comedy model. And I think it's worth recognizing that all of those things can be traced to a single point of origin, right? If you really think about Ghostface, he was kind of clumsy, right? You're seeing people, 110 pounds soaking wet with concrete shoes on, like flip them over, push them downstairs and all kind of stuff like that. And that's the kind of thing that didn't really happen to Jason or Michael Myers, all that much, right? They were much more, they had trained for this, you feel me? But I honestly don't think we would have films like Get Out, for example, which I think is, one of those horror films that, again, like I said, elevated the genre without Scream. And in fact, Jordan Peele has spoken about all of the ways in which Scream influenced his more cerebral horror filmmaking style. I've read lots of interviews where he's talked about that in depth. I think that Scream dared to break all the rules of horror films, and in the process, managed to change them forever. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with me that Scream is the film that elevated the slasher genre? What's your favorite scary movie? Let me know in the comments. And for those of you that might be new to the channel, be sure to like and share this video. If you really like the content, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I drop a new video. You can also support the channel by leaving a super thanks. If you should be so inclined, I'd really appreciate it. Also, be sure to go and check out themaskscreenwriter.com for more television and film reviews and info on my upcoming film projects. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I got screenplays to write. And I'll catch y'all on the next video.